Great. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I know the choice between the future of news and sunshine is a tough one, but we really appreciate you joining us. My name is Mark Little. Jennifer Brandel's beside me, Adam Thomas and Erika Owens are our panel today. They will all introduce themselves and their work, and I will as well, that we are doing. But just to set the scene, you probably all understand that we have a bit of irony here by telling you that we want to move slow and build things. And we're talking about a direct contrast with one of the most famous quotes of the sort of last wave of internet innovation. And that was Mark Zuckerberg's famous quote that we should, to his product team, move fast and break things. And if you're not breaking things, you're not moving fast enough. That was how he completed the quote. And that became one of the product development mantras for Facebook in the early days. Now, in fairness, by 2014, I think they realized maybe they broke a bit too much. So how did that work out for you? And we all know that essentially move fast and break things, and its associated obsession with growth in numbers, which I think has powered the platforms, this last wave of innovation, have I think become for us very clearly a real problem. And so what we're doing this panel, I hope, is to start setting out maybe a bunch of characteristics and maybe action points that define a new type of media and particularly a news business. And we say move slow and build things. And I think what characteristic we all share is that in this last wave of the internet, everything was about scaling your audience. And now the organizations I think we all work for, and others as well, realize that our organizations have to be powered by the depth of the connections within our communities, between us as journalists and the people we serve. So that's a defining characteristic. And that stands in contrast to, obviously platforms who had an obsession with growth, which resulted in algorithms that essentially weaponized those platforms. I think it also characterized some big name media companies, the darlings of the early digital age, who took venture capital money, and they all expected that massive big hockey stick, and now they're laying off journalists, and they're obviously going through their troubles as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we see ourselves contrasting with this move fast and break things philosophy, but I think more positively and optimistically, we're going to see what's working. And we're not just standing in contrast. We hopefully will come up with something new in the coming years, and maybe this is a start of trying to define it a little bit. So that's what I'm going to say to set the frame. I am going to ask each of the panelists maybe introduce themselves and the primary work they do, and how maybe that is actually in contrast to what we've seen before. So Jennifer, kick it off for us.
All right. Hi, I'm Jennifer Brandel. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Hearken, and I'm a former journalist who's running a company to help news organizations better listen to, better relate, and create better content for the publics they serve. So it is really about that depth and not necessarily about the tyranny of the quantifiable, but much more about those relationships. And what I found, this will be just a short story, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, is that trying to find funding for my startup was very, very difficult because we were a mission-based startup, but at the same time we had technology. So I was stuck between two worlds of become a nonprofit or become a for-profit. And the space in between is what I like to refer to as the valley of death. Because if you are somewhere of a hybrid of those approaches, the capital market has not yet evolved to meet your needs. It really tries to force you to one of those two binaries, which are limiting in a lot of different ways. And so some other founder friends of mine who are also, stuck in this world between mission and profit and purpose, ended up just talking a lot about it and devising really a value set for the types of companies we wanted to build that were in contrast to these Facebooks of the world, which are so-called quote-unquote unicorn companies that have $1 billion valuation or higher. You probably heard the word unicorn. And so we came up with an alternative that we call a zebra, or a zebra if you're in the US. And the idea is that unicorns are not real, but zebras are. And they're also black and white. They're for profit and for purpose. And their competitive advantage is not in crushing the competition and destroying and disrupting. It's about cooperation. And it's about surviving together and being better together. And if you think about zebras in the wild, they survive through being in a herd, not through destroying one another and being the best. It's about that mutualism. And so we developed basically a community of other founders and funders who are looking to build this valley of death into a valley of life for companies that see themselves a little bit differently, who aren't looking for hyperscale and growth above all else. And so the missions are really of Zebra companies are sustainable prosperity, plurality, instead of like always more, it's about enough and good enough. It doesn't have to be a scale of everything. And the shareholders are the community, not a small group of people who make a ton of money off of those companies. So that's a little bit just about zebras. So in part, I'm working at the intersection of trying to help journalism do this work and then trying to survive as a company in this capital market that has pretty fierce conditions right now for companies like this. So I'll turn it over to Adam.
Hi, so my name's Adam. I'm the director of the European Journalism Centre. So we are a Dutch non-profit that tries to build resilience into European journalism. And we do that by connecting journalists with new ideas, new skills, new people, new funding, primarily through grants and events, but primarily through a community and connecting European journalists. And I feel this tension that you're talking about a lot, both in my own personal career, because before that, I worked with Mark at Storyful, which was a startup, and I was part of the team that helped to scale an organization from being 26 people, I think, to 150 or so within 12 to 18 months. So I experienced firsthand that, you know, what it's like to hire 40 technology developers in a very short space of time. And then moving to somewhere like the European Journalism Centre, where I have a completely different view. I'm not in the newsroom building things, but I'm actually floating above, in some way, the entire journalism industry, trying to set out and chart a map for where we need to go in the future. And occupying, and I know, Mark, you're fond of this term of the balcony and the dance floor, of like occupying both places simultaneously, working. Yeah, working out how to be in both places, how to be a practitioner and execute and work with journalists on the ground, but also think strategically. One of the big things I'm working towards at the minute is how do I bring another 500 million euros of funding into the European media scene by increasing European philanthropy. And it's, you know, it's my dream to do that over the next 10 years, but like you have to think in a very systematic way and assess the entire problem. So I feel this tension as well of like an organization that's sort of doing two things at the same time.
Hi, I'm Erika from OpenNews. I'm director of OpenNews. We're an organization that supports technologists in journalism. So folks who work in developer, designer, data analyst, editor, and product roles. And we've really seen how folks working at this intersection are really used to working in a collaborative, interdependent way, a lot of open source projects and sharing credit and resources, and that they're wanting to bring that culture into the newsroom more broadly and shift how leadership can function within newsrooms as well. So we really work to support those networks and help people connect with one another, share challenges, skills, and resources, and figure out ways to help support news organizations in the future. So we also work in a very networked fashion and really have seen how the depth of connection with individuals in this network is what's really driving a lot of change and innovation in journalism. Even if originally people thought that innovation would come purely from technology, it really comes from the people and the relationships they have with each other as well.
I'm Mark Little, and my background is that we talk about unicorns and zebras. I'm a chameleon. I've worked for myself, I've worked for Rupert Murdoch, I've worked for Jack Dorsey, I've worked for the Irish taxpayer. So I started out as a journalist for 20 years, foreign correspondent, had a holy shit moment, and set up a company called Storyful because we wanted to essentially take all this incredible eyewitness media that was coming from places like Cairo and Damascus and validate, verify, and fight back against misinformation. That was a successful company. And I know I'm putting air quotes here, not because I don't think it was a success, but because there's a bit of a mixed feeling for me looking back in Storyful. If we had a slightly different structure, funding structure, maybe a different way of looking at things, maybe, just maybe, we may not have sold the company. And so when I went to Twitter, where I worked as the head of media partnerships in Europe, and I was the managing director of its headquarters in Ireland, I started thinking about this idea. Well, okay, so business model journalism is failing because it's being counted in clicks. Platforms are not doing anything journalism because they don't measure anything but emotion and outrage. We should measure quality. And finally, individuals are left swimming in this information overload. And we, myself, Anya Kerr, and our CTO, Paul Watson from South Africa, all the former Storyful crew got together again, and we built a company called Kinzen. We're trying to build empowering daily routines for people that they control. So it's trying to reward the best intentions of people who want a news routine in their day that's empowering to them, not their worst instincts. I'll stop now, but one of the things I did find was on funding this time around, myself and Anya have been very careful to try and take the right people to fund us, choose the right partners. It is really fucking hard, pardon my French. And I just want to say on the funding side, maybe just kick off with that a little bit, because if you haven't listened to Jennifer's podcast, it's The Pitch, right? Gimlet Media. Go just download The Pitch. Jennifer's on it, and it's the most amazing moment where you turn around and basically say, you know what, you're not the right investor for me. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
It was kind of like a Shark Tank or Dragon's Den experience where I'm standing. Well, just to back it up a little bit, I knew that venture capital, which is jet fuel essentially for startups, was not the kind of fuel that was right for my company, because we aren't prizing growth above all else. We're prizing helping the news community, and that might be incompatible. Actually, it is incompatible with just moving extremely fast and breaking a lot of things. So I went on the show The Pitch, which is to pitch venture capitalists about the idea. And I knew going into it there was no way they would like what we were doing, but I thought I could prove a point, at least to say that companies like mine are not allowed to exist in this ecosystem. And it's true, all of them were like, we don't think this is a good idea to fund you. But there was this one guy, Michael Hyatt, who's a very, very wealthy Canadian investor, and he said something to me in the course of the pitch, which was, I don't think this company is going to get to, $1 million monthly revenue, and it's not going to grow really fast enough. And I didn't, at that moment, I was like, yeah, you're right. It's not, and that's okay. I should still be allowed to exist. And I just said to him, well, I don't think you're the right investor for me. And that apparently just blew the room back, because the power dynamic in these situations is so, pardon my French, fucked up. And that you're putting your blood, sweat, and tears into this idea, this mission, this company that you're building, and then some random person who happens to have a lot of money, whether they earned it or they, inherited it, whatever it may be, has your life and your passion in the balance. And they're there to say, yes, no, you're good enough, you're not good enough. And I just think that is absolutely insane, and it's terrible, and I wanted to go on the show to basically point that out in a nice way. But afterwards, a lot of people thought it was crazy that I told this guy this wasn't the right funding. And it's just, it's not a right match, and it's not a values judgment, because they should be able to fund these companies. They should be able to do these experiments. I just want a right to exist and to find funding that matches the kind of business that I'm building. And the other reason I said he wasn't a good fit for us is also because he's kind of an asshole. And like, the other thing is, if you take money from people that you don't really see eye to eye with as a person, you're entering into a long-term relationship with them where they can call you and say, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Which can totally get you off course and confuse your mission, and really can tank your company if you have the wrong investors, personality-wise, too. So I didn't tell him that in the moment, as I don't want your money for two reasons. But essentially, that's why I said no. And
we promised takeaways, and we have number two here, no
yeah.
assholes.
No,
assholes.
Don't take money from assholes. There are nice people with money.
But it was really interesting that at the end, they all get together in your absence, and they all kind of say, we really should be able to fund this, but we can't, and we won't. But we should be able to. And you're screaming out, going, why don't you? But I think, Adam, one of the things you do really, really well is you find the kind of people who are not the assholes, and people who maybe want to fund journalism but just don't know quite how to do it. So tell us about the changing landscape for you now, seeing the fundraising for this kind of mission-driven business.
Yeah, I have a similar kind of story, and it's not quite on the same scale, and it wasn't on a podcast. But when I first came into the European Journalism Centre, we were in the running for a framework contract from the EU, which is a big, very long-term, 5-year contract. The EJC had these type of contracts before, and they allowed them to scale to 55 people and go really big and do the work, do some really, really valuable work. And we were in the running for the contract, and my first board meeting, I sat down with the board and said, even if we win this money, I'm not going to take it. And they all just looked at me and were freaking out. And they sort of said, why? And I said, well, look, here's all the reasons. And I laid out basically about the other areas that we should be getting money from, the kind of flexibility that we would have to redeploy that team into different areas. And also that this money, even though it was good on paper, wasn't really going to allow us to do what we wanted to do. And traditionally, 80% of the EJC's revenue has come from European Union funding. So this is like a fundamental structural change. Today, that funding is now 7% of our overall budget in 2 years. We've doubled our overall net revenue, and I've now gone from 9 funders to 18 funders in total. So I basically managed to change the whole organization around it, but it was that liberating moment of going, I can say no here, and there is something on the other side. And that's then been what has allowed me to work with funders who might not be so traditional in the space, either on the foundation side or working with maybe the technology companies, which, you know, to a lot of people, this festival and in journalism generally is it puts you in a kind of compromise space. But I think we rely on 26 years of knowing what we're doing, and I rely on the integrity of my team to know they have the resilience to be able to deal with this type of funding challenge. So yeah, it is a similar thing. It's unbelievably liberating to say no, but it can lead you to amazing new places.
That's really important, that, you know, don't ever do a deal you can't walk away from. When you say no to a VC, it's the most beautiful feeling, because you know it's going to change their mindset, and probably the price of the investment. It's going to give you more money and more runway, so no actually can be the most creative act, I think, for one of our kinds of business. But Erika, we were talking yesterday, and I was just making a point that, like a lot of us, like me, like I was a journalist and elite executive, and I came to this new way of doing things from kind of an elite. You're the product really of community journalism at its finest. And you were saying yesterday about, you know, forget about the funding aspect, how do you get the community to actually support you and be there?
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the really remarkable things about the community and the network that we support, is how much people see supporting the network as supporting each other. We had a fundraising drive last year, and people just offered so many testimonials about that they were donating because they wanted to see others of their peers get scholarships to go to events, get to engage more deeply in the network, get to access resources. And so it's really like caused me to think a lot about how the network itself is the source of support and sustainability, and how to like deepen those connections and the opportunities there. As I was thinking about it, it also reminded me, I'm just going to use a little prop of this book that has been like my favorite thing for the past year. It's called Emergent Strategy. It's by this woman, Adrienne Marie Brown, who is an amazing thinker, facilitator, writer based in the US. And in it, she lays out a lot of different concepts of how strategy can be emergent instead of needing to do like a strategic planning process where 3 years you know your whole plan, and how a lot of it is drawn from nature as well. There's one line that just, in looking back at it after this planning conversation we had, just really stood out to me, which is that she says she has some core principles, and one of them is move at the speed of trust. Focus on critical connections more than critical mass. Build the resilience by building the relationships. And I think you hear all of that in what we've all just been saying. And it's remarkable, like this book is also a guide and has like all of these tactics and strategies, and it's an amazing resource. Like I've been like handing it out to people. Our team is actually doing a book club around it. Like we're going pretty deep. But I think you can see how that kind of trust building with each other is so core to how we're able to continue and grow this work in a really intentional and deliberate way.
Just stay with you for a moment and talk about technology, because as I said earlier on, I think the way the technology of the last wave of internet was built was not on trust, right? It was in the opposite of it. And you are dedicated to leveraging technology for journalism and the communities they serve. So what kind of role does technology play in the relationship between technology and journalism in Open News, and also maybe your own experience of community journalism?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of the things that we've seen is how technology operates in a lot of newsrooms is that the technologists doing work in journalism often work across silos in a way that a lot of other roles in newsrooms don't. And so they really have this perspective on work that's really different, and that allows them to see the kind of broader cultural shifts that newsrooms need to do to be able to build these kind of deep relationships, trusted relationships with their audiences, to be able to build from the existing wisdom within their organizations already. And I think one of the things we talked about with technology as well is that there's this real drive to help. There's this real drive amongst technologists, I think more broadly, but certainly in journalism, to help make journalists' lives easier, to help connect better with audiences. And that a lot of the work is about how to match that sincere and enthusiastic desire to help with the real needs in the field. And so you see a lot of organizations figuring out how to translate that in different product roles, and I think also how to translate that into how technology, again, is connected with relationships and community, and so not just technology for technology's sake. And I think we're seeing that more and more.
Adam, one of your superpowers, I know from working with you, is helping technologists and journalists work together without going completely batshit crazy. Tell me about how you do that. I've never understood it. You're kind of like a technology journalism whisperer. That's really high expectations. Sorry, that question is very...
honestly have no idea. It's just always something I've been able to do. And I think for the first part of my career, I didn't feel like anyone was taking me seriously at all with this stuff, and I didn't realize that that it was kind of fine to be a dissenting voice in this space, and that those structures didn't actually necessarily make sense to each other. And then I've just always fallen into these bridge roles. In any organization that I've worked in, I've never really had a traditional job title or anything like that, and people have never really known what I am or what I should do, and that I've often just filled gaps where there's information not flowing between different parts of the between different parts of the organization. And I think that's really crucial. You need these people in an organization, and sometimes they're a luxury because you need to hire someone. I remember you hired and you brought me in as a director of business development.
We met, by the way, having coffee out in the square of Perugia. That's how we
It's very true. But like, you brought me in as a director of business development, a role I'd never done, but I guess that probably helped you sell into the investors and the board and so on, that like, hey, this guy's going to make us some money. And I didn't know what I was doing in that regard, and I probably did make us some money at the end of the day. But really, I think what I did was just spot some of the gaps in the organization where information wasn't flowing. And then I learned quickly, so I kind of learned to speak with authenticity, the language of the different groups. And then it's a similar role now. I'm not necessarily connecting, let's say, technologists and journalists, but I'm connecting foundations and journalists, or I'm connecting different areas of newsrooms that aren't necessarily talking to each other.
Jennifer, I noticed that you talk about Hearken being tech-enabled, not a technology company. It strikes me that everyone here, and a lot of our movement is defined with that idea. It's more important as the connections in the company than the technology the company leverages.
Yeah, that's true. So we're still struggling against the perception that we're just a tech company and we're about widgets and code and everything. And really, we're about a paradigm shift and a new way of thinking. And that requires a lot of high-touch consulting, conversations, therapy sessions with journalists, nothing to do with technology. And so we try to say that we're tech-enabled. The tech becomes useful once you have started to think a little differently, had some different experiences, and you're bought into looking at the public as a partner instead of a consumer from which to extract value from them. So that's something that we think about a lot, is how do we create the connective tissue. We were talking a little bit yesterday in our session. This is a new concept that I learned about recently, and I'm like sharing it with everyone I know, like you're sharing that book, is that there's a new discovery in the human body from scientists, that there's this organ called the interstitium. And what it is, it's all the connective tissue in the blood that goes between the organ, the heart and the stomach and everything. And they're suddenly realizing that that is key to everything, which is a little surprising. You'd think they would have known that before, but hey, we just discovered dark matter how many years ago? So I think there's a lot of room for growth and also monetization and value creation in these bridge roles, in this work of networking and being a node for people. It's something that's hard to quantify easily because it's, any effect you have is going to ripple out and you won't know exactly what happens. But I think we all know intuitively that when you act as a networker and when you act as someone who's looking at the depth of relationships, the incredible positive outcomes that are result from that are stuff that is the priceless, which is why we wake up in the morning. It's where the meaningful work actually happens.
Erika, does it change the culture of the company if that's your focus, is connections?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what we're all talking about is necessary for the organizations to undergo. And that's really something that we're seeing as well, is that these kinds of bridge roles are something that more organizations are realizing that they need. More organizations are realizing that they have folks who are already working in that way, and with a little bit of empowerment would be able to make the kinds of decisions that would allow organizations to be more responsive to a lot of the changes happening in the field. So yeah, I think organizations are seeing that, and they're getting to learn from amazing organizations like this about what some models are that they can learn from.
Can I just ask you a contradiction there, Adam, about the engaged journalism accelerator, right? So we're all talking about moving slow, but engaged journalism is something you hear a lot of from companies like ours and people like us. Just talk me through a little bit about what you mean by that concept and what the purpose of that accelerator is.
Sure. So, we're talking here about bridge roles, and I've always felt fundamentally that a news organization is a bridge role for society, right? It's a way of bridging perspectives and connecting people and helping people understand other opinions and what's going on in the world around them. And we just felt like there was a real movement in Europe around this. I spent 2 years traveling through Europe for this job, talking to as many people as I could, and I just understood that there was a whole new wave of organizations that are somehow occupying the space that local news organizations used to do, but also then they can scale up and reach new audiences. And we were searching around for a term, and engaged journalism has been one that's been used in the US a lot. We say in the team that this is not a new idea, but it's an idea whose time has come. And we were very, very lucky to find a partner at exactly the right time in the News Integrity Initiative who said, well, let's foster this, let's see if there's something there. So we set up an accelerator, and yeah, you're absolutely right, there's an inherent contradiction in terms there, because we are not trying to scale these organizations like crazy, but what we're trying to do is, I guess, is accelerate the learning that they have, and accelerate that process of learning, both, firstly, by giving them time and space at a really crucial part, to basically focus on some new ideas, but not distract them with sort of, prototype money or anything. So they have to have proven loyalty and an idea that at least has shown some sign that it's working. And then we basically give them a small amount of money to work on this. But we're actually pretty tough on them. We ask a lot of time. They have to run monthly experiments. They have to really check in with us, not because we want to see how the money is being spent. We don't want the money back. But we want them to be just really conscientious about the experiments they're running. So it's something, it should actually be the engaged journalism decelerator, because we're really just trying to give time and space. And it's working. We have now 120 news organizations in a database that are somehow following this mantra of connecting to communities in their reporting, but also their revenue in a really, really deep way. And they're all doing it in totally different ways. And it's a real movement in Europe.
Can I ask all three of you, maybe just on the product development? Clearly there are the theory of it fail fast, which is still good, right? We move them slow, but so how does this sort of idea be more purposeful, mission-driven, change the nature of the way you develop products? Anyone want to jump into that?
You want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think if you're mission-driven, then you have a really clear shared starting point and shared investment in the goal that you're all going after. And I think even within journalism, there's so many different ideas of public service and speaking truth to power. And so, being able to narrow that down a little bit definitely helps folks focus. I think one thing in terms of product development and this work more broadly that resonated from what you were just saying, Adam, is in terms of time and space, and that I think so much of what all of us do is provide time and space to talk, to reflect, to look back at projects, to plan out, to even devise what the mission is together, to not just assume that we all already agree. And I think that that concept of needing to convene spaces that are thoughtfully and intentionally pulled together is so core here, and is also one of the things that is maybe not the most exciting venture capitalist thing to fund, but is definitely a key theme, and is an underlying thing that allows all of this work and development to happen.
I also just want to shout out your festival in particular, because I think you do this better than anyone else from what I've heard. I still haven't been, but everyone I hear, I mean, you've been, right? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. SourceCon, if you've never been, SourceCon runs a number of different gatherings. I'm going to speak on behalf of your... But it is the most soulful gathering of people working at the intersection of technology and really helping newsrooms thrive and change and evolve. And what I love about it is that you can be in the room with someone super fancy, head of technology at the New York Times, and there's just a name on their name tag. It's not about outranking people. It's about everyone working with one another as humans. And I feel like that's something that's really, really special about SourceCon. One of the things in terms of answer to your question about technology is that if we were a tool company or technology company, we would be judged by how much time our quote-unquote users, which is a word I don't like, are spending on our tech. And the idea would be to make it sticky, to have people coming back to our tech all the time. And that's never been an intention of Hearken and the platform. It's actually to use it as a way of actually having real-life interactions with people and having relationships with them. So you want to bounce in and bounce out. It's not there to spend all day on and be distracted and be online. It's about spending time well with humans in the world. So that's something that also, I guess, makes us incompatible with kind of a VC tech model.
Which actually brings us to definitions of success and metrics of success. So there's obviously a movement now, Center for Humane Tech, you may know of, that talks about time well spent. our job is not to trap people in content silos forever. There's studies down showing us that the apps people feel happiest with are the ones they spend least time with but get most productivity from. You know, after about 20 minutes on Facebook, the studies show you get bored, but you still keep going, and you don't know why. So I think that's one of the metrics we think about, obviously, at Kinzen, is how we can just give you the bang for the buck in the time you have. But one other thing I'd love to talk about is just in terms of slow news, right? So I've seen people now setting themselves up, and their definition of success is like methodical, mindful, just sit down and have a slow, kind of mindful experience. What do you think about slow news? Are we sort of, is this a necessary part of our movement?
I think so, yeah. I mean, personally, I've never been a news junkie. I'm not the person who's refreshing the feed all the time. I want to see the analysis, and I want to see the meaning, and I want to see from a non-emotional place kind of what does this all mean? And I think that with new companies like Tortoise that's coming out, and some of the longer form work where some websites are just putting out one article a day. And personally, that feels nice when you feel like you're just being inundated with information all the time, that you can complete something and check it off the list and not have the infinite feed and the infinite scroll that makes you feel like a hamster just trapped in the I've never checked something off the list. So I'm a fan of kind of slowing things down and thinking a little bit more. So I don't know what y'all think.
Yeah, I think what you said about sense making is really huge, and is certainly something that technologists that we work with in the newsroom come from a lot of different backgrounds. It's definitely not like there's just one pathway, and folks find, like Adam was recounting, a lot of different roles and ways to explore in journalism. But I think that there's often a core interest in helping people make sense of the world, in coming from maybe a civic tech background or working in broader civil society organizations, and trying to help people figure out how to like engage more with the neighborhood around them, really understand what's happening with a topic. So I think that that's definitely of a piece with the slow news movement, is really helping people build that understanding, and that's something that people bring with their technical work in journalism.
Adam, what do you think the metrics of success, the new metrics for a media business? I mean, we're all talking about rejecting clicks and eyeballs and all that kind of stuff, but you know, we have to have some definition of success, even if we're moving slower and methodically.
We're definitely seeing a lot more measurement of impact, actually, from news organizations. And there's a certain tension at the heart of this. And a lot of people actually blame foundations for bringing impact in to the news space because that's how they quantify and value their work. But actually, I think it's sort of worth bouncing that back onto journalists and sort of pushing that back to them and saying, well, why do you have a job? Because I think if you speak to most journalists, they'll tell you it's because they wanted to somehow change the world or make things better or engage society in a different way. And that's essentially what impact is. It's just that you're thinking about it consequently before you do the work. That doesn't mean you have a kind of presumed outcome at the end necessarily. It's just thinking about the types of things that you want to measure to see how's your work affected the world in some kind of way. So for instance, when we work with news organizations as grantees, we often think about micro, meso, and macro impact on that level. So it's a micro impact might be someone read the story and decided to donate to an NGO, for instance, or they decided to take to the streets or write to their MP or something. And then you scale that all the way up to a macro impact, which may be a government, there's like a groundswell of public opinion and a high court judge ruling gets overturned or something like that. But one of the big problems is at the moment is news organizations aren't set up to measure that and to understand when it happens and to track when that happens. And therefore they find it actually hard to find what work that they're doing in the world and the effect of their type of work. So I think there's an inherent tension there at the minute. And I think there's a lot of news organizations who are wrestling almost with the core principles of what a journalist is. Am I supposed to be someone who has been supposed to be totally balanced, totally objective, and entirely neutral here? Or is that actually possible? Is it really possible for a human to really switch off every unconscious bias in their brain before they start reporting on a piece of news? I think it's a big challenge at the heart of every newsroom at the minute.
One of the things I think we find with Kinzen about metrics is that it's so much easier to judge success if the user of the product, the individual, the community member, is actually telling you what they think. Yeah. You don't have to raid their browsing history. You don't have to steal their data. You just ask them. And I think, Erika, that's one thing you were talking yesterday, is that the people really do want to pay it forward and they want to express their opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people want to have that impact impact in their communities and see that their work is having that impact. I think that the kind of tension that you were just raising, Adam, is always so funny to me given journalism's obsession with awards, and that a lot of awards are driven by, like, did someone get ousted? Did a bill get passed? Was there some, like, significant macro impact? And so, like, this has been the case for decades. And the idea that, like, it's new to be thinking about what it means to have impact, or to, like, really help people grapple with, like, what's the role of a journalist. Like, in some ways, that decision was already made, but then when it comes up into individual conversations, people get really mired in this objectivity question, and it's just always struck me as strange given that context. But I think it really does come back to relationships. Like, something I think a lot about is about how journalism is such a key part of the ecosystem of community organizing and of work going on in our local communities, and that, like, I've been in conversations with community groups, and it's like, how do we get something on the news? How do we make sure that people know what's going on with our organization? And journalists want people to be engaging with their coverage, and there's a clear interest in if not combining efforts, in at least, like, having complementary roles there. But there's not a lot of space for having those kinds of discussions, I think often because of this kind of objectivity question that comes out. But I think if we look to even some of the really great examples of impact journalism, you'll find that there is this kind of complementary work.
I just wanted to add something there in terms of the metrics that we think about with Hearken and our partners, is that our whole model is built on curiosity, so it's about answering the public's questions. And so if you think about the way that a lot of news organizations still work, it's kind of in this paternalistic approach of, do we give the public what they want or what they need? Like, they're the parents of the public, and if we give them what they want, they're gonna want candy, and our metrics are gonna be clickbait and, you know, analytics for how deep did this cat story permeate the internet. And if you give them what they quote unquote need, like their vegetables as a parent, then you look for awards to see, did we do the hard-hitting news that the public really needs? But I think if you change the question to what doesn't the public understand or know that you can help them figure out, then the way that you know if you've done your job is if you answer their damn question and you ask them, are you satisfied with the information I got? So the joke that I had when I was a journalist first starting out with this methodology in a newsroom, and I still think it's the greatest metric there is the number of handwritten thank you cards we got from the public. How our desks in the newsroom were just full of handwritten thank you cards from the people that actually asked us questions and that we worked with. But I know that executives might not be satisfied with that answer, but it does say something.
Can I just say, for the pitch, that program we talked about, you were asked at one point, give us an example of how Hearken works. And it's before you call the guy the asshole, but it is the best pitch. So give us the example you gave in the pitch of how you judge success, someone actually taking part.
Yeah, so I think the example I gave in the pitch was this woman, Denise, lives in Nashville, Tennessee in the US, and she had a question about a park that was in her neighborhood, and it was called Fred Douglass Park. And she wanted to know, who's Fred Douglass? Because if he's got a park named after him, maybe there should be a plaque so we know a little bit more about who he was. And so she asked the local news organization. They were using Hearken and collecting questions. And the news organization thought, this is kind of interesting. Who is this guy? We should have some record of him if he's famous enough to have a park named after him. And so they ended up taking the question to the city archives, to city council, to try and figure out who was this guy. Because there is a very famous American named Frederick Douglass, who is an abolitionist, who is an African-American man, who is an incredible leader of his time. But his name is Frederick, and they spelled Douglas wrong. So if that was actually his park, then there's two slights. They gave him a nickname, and they spelled his last name wrong. And it turns out through the newsroom reporting on this and going to city council and getting the actual record, they found out it was a slight. It was supposed to be named Frederick Douglass Park 80 years prior, but the town wasn't ready for that at that time. And because she asked a question, and because the news organization paid attention, they changed the sign. They made it Frederick Douglass Park. They rededicated it to the African-American community of Nashville. And if you think about this woman, if she had this question, and she wanted to make that change, she would have to get petitions and protests, and how could she actually get the park to do that work? And they would think of her as a nuisance, leave us alone, we have more important things to do than to look at this old park. But because a news organization was involved, the city council couldn't help but pay attention and do something about it. So this is about the news organization being that conduit and being, instead of like the gatekeeper, is being that interstitium that's flowing the blood between the public and the people in power and the changes that need to happen. So that's just one example.
It's just a great example, and I think also I'm always stunned by people saying to us, well, you know, people will only do what's easy, right? No one's ever asked them, if we made the right thing easy, would you choose it? If, you know, we asked you to give us your opinion, talk about the statue. And so what we're finding more of, I think, is we currently have shallow metrics, claps, likes, applause, because they're kind of passive. You just kind of click on them. But when you start asking people for qualitative assessments, this inspired me, it's not that hard to ask people. And then suddenly that data is the most valuable signal. So with Kinzen, for example, we're finding when someone says they want something, like something, and tell you why, it is an exponentially stronger signal to the publisher than a click, a like, or you know, some sort of shallow metric. So I think we underestimate the power for journalism in giving our, and I was going to say users, I hate that phrase, but our citizens the ability to say something to us. And that's way more powerful, I think, for machine learning systems, for data scientists. So that's anyway my sort of little bit about metrics. But I want to just, before we ask for questions, and I'd love, by the way, people think of examples where this is going right, this more purposeful kind of community journalism we're talking about. But before I do, Adam, this is the year of resilience for the EJC, right? Resilience. That's a kind of strange word if you're a traditionalist to be using about journalism. Tell me why this is the year of resilience for you guys.
Well, actually, one of the reasons is it's not just the year, but it fits into a 5-year strategy for us. So when I spent the last 2 years trying to work out and diagnose what the problems were in the European ecosystem and what it would take to help a news organization and a journalist thrive. And we sort of thought about it in terms of, well, there are threats on press freedom, there are threats around funding, there are a lot of threats around the health of journalists in newsroom and culture and leadership, those sorts of things. We've got a lot of new skills that need to be learned around data, for instance, and a lot of new storytelling, like competing with new formats and so on. And when I just thought about that broad thing, I just really understood that resilience was essentially the answer to how you could describe being able to help journalists adapt in all of those changing environments, because that's what resilience is, right? It's about being able to change in that environment and not thinking about it. You know, you can think about the changing organization as, firstly, you can think about viability, right? So you can think that we just need to work out, is this thing a thing? Is it maybe going to work? And then you've got sustainability, which is like, can we make it work long term? And then you have resilience, which is a much longer one, which is we've proved out that this works. We know that news is a thing and it works, and journalism has got a value, but obviously it's facing a changing environment, and how can we change that? And then the other side of it, of course, was to my own organization. I talked about the type of change that we've had in terms of revenue, and we've doubled the team, and we've opened new offices. So it also felt like the perfect word to describe the type of change that we were going through, and that we also understood the community that we were trying to serve as well, that we were in the same place. We're still trying to find our own funding and trying to change ourselves and understand our community better. And it just seemed like the perfect word that managed to encapsulate all of that.
I love that word, because as a journalist I was taught endurance, right? You go into a war zone, you get out again, you survive. I became an entrepreneur, and I realized endurance is shit. It's terrible. Like, you're so tired all the time, and you're soaking up everyone else's anxiety, and you're going to get up tomorrow morning, and it's going to happen all over again. And you start realizing resilience actually is the thing.
And I also think it's really important to add that a lot of the changes that have affected journalism are actually outside of journalism itself, right? Like, these are changes in society, these are changes in the way information flows. These are all really big fundamental shifts. And a lot of the time we beat ourselves up as news organizations and journalists and say what went wrong and what did we do badly. And sometimes it's actually nice to understand that there are bigger things out there than journalism. These things are changing around us, and we do have to work out how we can adapt to a changing environment.
But Erika, how do you deal with people who come to you and say, like, I don't get it, I don't buy into your model? And, that's such an awful thing for an entrepreneur when just people say, I don't get it, and they feel proud of it. You almost have the laugh on their voice.
Yeah, I guess when we were talking, preparing for this panel, it was like, that's fine, you don't have to, I'll work with someone else, because there's so many people who do get it. And I think that that's just something to really keep in mind, is that like this networked, connection-driven, relationship-focused way of working is necessary. it works, as Jennifer just described. And there's a lot of people invested in making it happen and in supporting one another and making it happen. I mean, that's what we've really seen with our work, is about how much the network that we work with supports one another. And so if there are folks who don't get it, like, that's fine. They probably have other places that are more comfortable for them. But there are a lot of folks who do get it and are really invested in supporting one another.
So I think we have a roving microphone. Any questions? Well, right away, we have 3 people here. And also, by the way, if you have experience to share as well, please feel free.
Hi, thanks all. I feel like I've come to church, so thanks for this. So my name is Lucia, and I run an organization in Romania, and we're direct beneficiaries of what Adam and his team have been doing over the past 2 years. And we're also playing with Hearken this year and experimenting. So it's wonderful to see our model. We've been around for about 10 years and felt crazy for the first 7, 8 of them. And it feels like our model is validated, both in terms of content, where journalism is not just news, and also in terms of the hybrid model of revenue and building a community and everything else. What's interesting about this model being validated, and I've talked to Jen and Adam a little bit about this, and I just wanted you to share, and all of you maybe to share with us some thoughts, is having success or the model being validated brings some interesting new challenges that when you were 10 or 15 people sort of hoping this model gets validated was a different struggle. And now that it's working, there's new questions that we don't know how to answer about recruiting, about organizational culture, about managing medium-sized, and I mean 20 plus, 25 plus organizations. So what are your thoughts on building those in also a slow and better way?
It's so hard. I'm going through this with my company right now. We were me, and then 3 people, and then 5 people, and now 18 people, and serving 17 countries. And so it's been a real road. And I think one of the things that's present in all of our work is this idea of intentionality. So it's about not just doing things because someone says this is how it's done, but thinking about, is this the right thing for us, right thing at this time? How do we move it forward? And so one of the things we've been playing with at Hearken that I'd like to document and write more about, and I also want to talk more about how you all share your work so generously in your process and how you're doing things. But one of the things that we've been playing with is not treating humans as cogs in some economic machine. So when you're writing a job description, not just looking for a person that fits that thing 100%, but looking for someone who fits it maybe 60% and has 40% of a superpower that you're going to explore together, and that's going to change the dynamic of the organization. The thing that's hard is that then if that person leaves or things change, then it has to become a whole new organization again, which is really difficult. But I think at the same time, if you can get folks in and allow them the dignity to be not just their job description, but bring their full selves and other talents to the mix, then your organization can grow in ways you never would have imagined that are just far beyond in a really positive way.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that documentation, Hearken's documentation on that whole hiring process is like phenomenal and a great resource there. I mean, I think part of the answer to your question also comes back to this network piece, is that those are questions that so many of us are struggling with. At the Allied Media Conference last summer, I co-ran a session with Andrea Hart from City Bureau, which is another phenomenal effort that is really leading the way with a lot of this engaged journalism work, and even deeper and exploring beyond what engaged journalism can be as well. And it was like standing room only. Like, there were so many people who wanted to talk about how can you build organizations that have the values that you care about in the world also present in how you run your organization. And it wasn't something that we had like a whole list of quick answers to, but it was really encouraging that there were so many people who wanted to explore that together. So that's also something that, if that's something you're curious about, we're really curious to continue like convening some small network around those questions.
Thank you so much for this. I also feel the same way, that I've kind of a bit religious. So I've worked with nonprofit public art organizations to have artists reporting on the news around the world. And what we would do is we partnered with The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Foreign Policy, and it was all kinds of artists that were all over the world. And now I have a project with IBEAM, which is a Center for Art and Technology, where we support artists working with major news publications, kind of like the Pulitzer Center, but very, very, very small scale. The thing that I was so interested in, what you were mentioning, is this idea that the metrics. There is so much pressure with a small nonprofit to report back to the foundations the impact, and usually it's numeric. And what you mentioned, which kind of blew my mind, is there a way we can have an honest conversation with foundations about shifting their expectations and for what they want for next rounds of funding? Because I've found with so many of the projects that we've done, they've floated out in the world, they've been seen by a lot of people. A lot of people didn't connect it back to our original work, and then it becomes very difficult for the foundations to understand, well then, why should we keep funding this if you don't have the exact numbers? So if anybody could speak to that.
Would you mind if I just take another question and we keep that in mind? We'll come and wrap up because we only have a few minutes left. I think there was there a question? Someone else a question? Yeah. And
yes, so thank you so much. This was wonderful to listen to. I guess my question is, you all seem very young, and is that a generational sort of thing? You know, this change in the paradigm, because I'm kind of observing similar things. So it's interesting to understand what causes this sort of change and inclusiveness in terms of kind of the practices.
And there's a question just at the back, I think, and we'll then sort of wrap these up if we could on our closing comments. By the way, I was born in 1968. Thank you. I'll take that one.
I'm also feeling quite religious. I have found my sect. Also, thank you. This is actually the best panel possibly that I've been to in Perugia, and I've been to many good ones. But building up on your question, and Adam, I think something that you said about impact is just makes so much sense in terms of, you know, journalists thinking about impact as a way of kind of building up on their innate desire to change the world and do good and so on. And I think that's a very helpful way of phrasing it. And I think I just want to, you know, I think that you basically ask the question that I wanted to ask, but how do we talk to, what's your advice on talking to funders and talking to them about impact? Because we have exact same issue when we're counting Facebook likes, and it seems meaningless and it's a waste of time, and we can't, and our funding depends on it, and it's infuriating, and it's got to stop.
So it's great. Well, we'll wrap up. There's a practical question and a lovely compliment, which we'll deal with. Maybe Adam, you kick off the foundations.
This work is particularly tough. We set up something called the Journalism Funders Forum, which is it's basically a community of funders and journalists to basically work on exactly these problems. We spent 2 years mapping the relationships between journalists and funders, and we saw it as a wicked problem. We saw it as a very, very complex set of relationships with many different pressures from outside, and we tried to identify points of intervention where we could try and fix the broken things about this relationship. We published some blueprints on this, and there are 10 different ways that we're trying to work in this area, and we've also have a number of different solutions that we're working on. We definitely haven't fixed it, but we know that the foundations also hate this too, right? Like they don't want to do this either, and somewhere along the way there's a communication gap, and I think it's actually the fault of both sides around this kind of thing. One is the realization of journalists not being willing to admit that they make a change in the world, and then the second is on foundations who often feel like they are very, very risk averse, and numbers help them feel more secure. And I do feel like the Journalism Funders Forum plus media impact funders, at least in the journalism space, is definitely doing great work at bridging those gaps. So I think what we need to do is bring more voices into that space, because it's definitely making a change, but it's a big problem with lots of other things that come part of it. But it's one of the top things on the agenda at every single one of those meetings.
So just one quick resource there. At our conference, SourceCon Power, last fall, Molly Diaguar, who recently was the head of News Integrity Initiative, and Jessica Clark of Media Impact Funders, hosted a session that was gathering feedback from grantees, and they wrote an open letter to media funders sharing that feedback back. And they're speaking from like funder and consultant kind of perspective. So that is on Medium. It's something that you can share. It's something you could share directly with the funder or just tweet out. But it's also something that like they've been sharing. They published it right before the Night Media Forum, which is an important convening for a lot of journalism funders, intentionally, because they're trying to help bring that space together between grantees and funders. And I think just one thing on the age point. It's really hard to know how much people involved in this work are self-selecting or where it's coming from. But we've done some surveying of our community, and over half of folks who respond to our survey have been in the field of journalism and tech for 5 years or more. So 5 years isn't 30 or 50 years in the field, but it's maturing, and I think that's something that's really helpful to keep in mind, and I think is also part of seeing how these networks are strengthening and moving into more leadership roles to change and evolve journalism.
And real quick on the metrics front, this is something that is really, really tough, and I kind of always, yeah, oh, this is perfect actually. So one of the things I always think about asking people in kind of a Socratic method way is, how do you measure a mother's love? So thank you, child. It's like, how do you measure that? And start there and say, well, just because you can't measure it easily, does it mean it's not important and you don't want to fund it, you know? So I don't know, this is just a crazy idea. We'll see if this happens. But what if we had the reverse metrics of how do you know if we really screwed up? And let's see what are the things we could measure if we're really not doing a good job, because the work we're doing is systemic. It's hard to measure, but maybe we can measure if we're really doing the wrong things and have the funders look at our screw up instead of what likes and clicks and the impact that we have. Just an idea.
So listen, we move slowly. Time is not our friend today. I'm sorry to say we're wrapping up. I would just say one thing. I'm the old guy in the panel, and the good old days were not that good, right? The days when as a foreign correspondent, I would stand in places where I could see bodies around me, and I would be on air going, words cannot describe what I'm seeing here. Words could describe what I was seeing, but it was a passive one-dimensional relationship with someone sitting in an armchair back in Dublin, Ireland. And then suddenly I found Twitter, and they started talking to me, these people, asking me questions. I would go into a TV studio asking the Minister for Finance at the time, Ireland's crisis economically, and these would be questions from people who were just more knowledgeable than me. They were speaking truth to power to me. And in some ways, that's the generational shift. That's what inspired me, and I think inspires us. So we don't have a name yet. I think we've proved that there is a movement here. I think we've proved, for example, that great quote that we are moving at the speed of trust. That's what defines us, and I think we'll work out the rest of it as we power ahead, mindfully. So the mass has ended. Go in peace, slowly.